The day they brought me here, they said it was for my own good. Yet all I heard was farewell. My name is Beulah Ellis, 74. That morning, the town wore autumn like a soft shawl. Golden light slid down shopfront windows and spilled across the hood of Daniel's SUV. Maple leaves drifted in slow spirals before settling on the windshield, as if the season itself wanted to delay my leaving. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and damp apples, the kind that makes your hands remember harvests. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the road, repeating that this was safer. He's always been the practical one, crisp shirts, firm plans, the sort who believes a checklist can steady the heart. His tone was the kind people use to soothe a nervous horse. Laura sat behind him, fingers tapping through emails, her lips pressed tight, already thinking about the meeting she'd join once she found Wi-Fi. She said the place had wonderful reviews, that I'd make friends. She reminded me my house had stairs, and that stairs were statistics. Mark sat quietly beside me, the middle child twice over, forever slipping between conflicts. When our eyes met in the mirror, he looked away and said, "We should think about the good parts." Maple Grove emerged at the end of a long lane lined with trees blazing in red and gold. The brick building glowed like an ember cooling in the dusk. A fountain murmured in the courtyard, its water sprinkled with drifting leaves like little boats going nowhere. Inside, the floor gleamed, carrying the faint scent of lemons. A TV hummed the morning news in a low, comforting voice. A food cart rolled by with bowls of oatmeal and cinnamon, and I felt hunger and grief bump shoulders. Daniel told the receptionist we had an appointment and mentioned he'd handled the forms since I get overwhelmed. Laura glanced at her watch, saying we needed to keep things moving. I nodded as though I agreed. In my mind, another scene unfolded. Our kitchen 30 years ago, when my hands were surer and the table was alive with noise. The roast ticked in the oven, the radio played gentle Motown, and the boys drummed their forks until their father cleared his throat in mock thunder. We said grace without looking at the clock. Laura bragged about her spelling bee ribbon. Mark tried to swap green beans for rolls. Daniel measured slices to be sure no one was shortchanged, right down to the last crumb. That dining room was small, yet it held everything. The laughter, the weary feet, the stories of scraped knees, the promises we tossed across plates like tiny boats that always reached shore. I can still feel the heat on my face when I opened the oven. Still taste the joy in announcing the pie had set. Back in the admission office, the clock's ticking was louder than any church bell. The director smiled, explaining activity programs and a calendar dotted with cheerful nouns. I heard the words, but I also heard the slow rasp of something closing. Daniel said, "Mom forgets the time and repeats herself." He said it gently, like a headline he wished wasn't true. Then looked at me as though the right look could make him less correct. Laura slid a stack of forms toward me, suggesting it would be best if I signed them today. She called it being proactive, promising she might drop by after work, maybe later in the week. Mark brushed my elbow lightly, assuring me this was only temporary, just until things were sorted. His tone felt rehearsed, like words borrowed from someone else's script. I asked if anyone had bothered to ask what I wanted. The director laced her fingers together and replied, "Everyone wants the same thing, to feel secure." Daniel said I would be grateful one day. We moved down the corridor toward my room. The door stood slightly ajar, like a mouse about to speak. From one room came the steady clicks of knitting needles. From another a cough that cracked like a breaking branch. My room waited, orderly, the bed made, curtains open to a sliver of blue. On the table, a vase of 3 sunflowers faced the window. A fresh quilt lay folded. A promise unaware of the weight promises carry. Daniel set my suitcase on the chair, pointed out the call button, and advised against packing more. He said the house needed clearing before the month's end. Laura placed a framed family picture on the dresser, adjusting it twice. She noted how close I'd be to town, making visits easier. She assured me the staff was trained. Words meant for avoiding thoughts about tenderness. Mark draped my sweater over the chair, studying the quilt's pattern. He promised to tend the garden so my peonies wouldn't miss a season, and said he'd call tonight. I tried on this new life like shoes in a store, pacing slowly to find where it rubbed. My fingers brushed the wall. My ears caught the roll of soft cart wheels and the gentler sighs that linger in places where days stack neatly. Their hugs felt like those given in haste. Daniel's was brief and firm. Laura's came with a phone in one hand and a promise in the other. Mark stayed a little longer before letting go. I watched them walk away, 3 figures who once tugged at my skirt and now tugged at their calendars. I sat on the bed, counting breaths until the door clicked shut. My mind drifted to Sunday gravy, the scrape of forks against heavy plates, and a vinyl record skipping on the same lyric. To how boys turn into men while you're rinsing dishes. A nurse guided me to the dining room for lunch. Her eyes were kind, her presence carrying the weary grace of someone who keeps showing up. She told me the soup was chicken, the rolls still warm. I smiled, thanked her, and kept the rest inside. Some things you hold close because they are your last steady warmth. Some things you speak only when the room is ready to hear them. The day they brought me here, I heard goodbye, but also the faint click of another door opening somewhere far off. Last week, a lawyer from California called. My sister had kept a secret, and now it belonged to me. If I chose to act on it, everything here, and my place in it, would shift. A week after arriving at Maple Grove, the phone rang again with a voice from another life. The lawyer's tone was measured, but his words spilled like light through a crack. My sister had died, leaving me $6.8 million. I sat still, thumb tracing the armrest, letting the number settle like a seed seeking soil. That afternoon, I went to the front desk and asked for the public records computer in the library. The machine was slow but steady. I combed through property filings and corporate registrations for Maple Grove and its parent company, writing names, addresses, and dates into a small spiral notebook hidden under crossword puzzles. I discovered the chain owned 3 Oregon facilities under one holding company, each weighed down with loans that left them vulnerable. That night, I called the attorney back to ask how to buy them quietly. We spoke of trusts, shell entities, and ways to keep my name absent from headlines until I was ready. His answers were exact, and I could hear him lean in when he realized I wasn't just a curious old woman, but a client with a plan. Days passed in their unhurried rhythm. Mrs. Powell, once a literature teacher, sat by the window with a stack of saved essays, reading a paragraph aloud before gazing at the air as if the chalkboard might reappear. Across the hall, Mr. Harland, a retired Navy man, spun sea tales scented with salt and diesel, his hands sculpting waves, masts, and storms that never touched shore. I listened more than I spoke, taking note of the worn carpet, the flickering fluorescent lights, and the sagging chairs in the common room. I saw which aides stayed past their shifts, and which vanished the moment the clock struck their hour. I had counted the residents whose families visited more than once a month, and the list was short. One Sunday, I stood at the courtyard's edge watching a family gathered under a maple tree. A small boy chased drifting leaves while his grandmother held his jacket like a lifeline. The parents poured coffee from a thermos, passing around muffins still warm. Their laughter floated across the lawn, and I drew an unbroken line between that sound and the quiet waiting in my own room. That was when the plan hardened in my mind. Within a month, the trust had finalized purchase agreements for Maple Grove and its 2 sister facilities. The next morning, I walked the halls knowing the ground beneath my feet was, in a way, mine, though no one here realized it. My first directive ordered new lighting, carpet, and sturdy chairs. The second called for fresh paint in colors like sunrise instead of dusk. The kitchen received upgraded appliances and a budget for local farm produce. The activity room finally had its piano tuned. In the garden, I placed benches beneath the trees and added raised vegetable beds. Then came the new policy. Every resident would be entitled to see their family at least once a week. If relatives couldn't commit, visits would be limited to weekends, a measure not meant to punish, but to safeguard the time that mattered. I signed with a pen that felt heavier than its size, keeping my name off memos and my face out of meetings. The changes came quietly, like a tide no one saw being pulled by the moon. At night, I walked the corridors, hearing softer laughter, smelling richer coffee, sensing a place coming back to life. My reflection hadn't changed, but beneath the skin, a steadiness had returned. Something I hadn't felt since the house was mine and the children were small. I was no longer just another resident. I was the keeper of this place. And I wasn't finished. The first call came from Daniel. The Maple Grove receptionist later told me his voice was low but sharp. each word clipped as though he were reading formal charges. He demanded to know who thought it acceptable to control how often he could visit his mother. The next morning, Laura's email arrived. 3 paragraphs of corporate outrage accusing the facility of overstepping its bounds. Mark never called, but when I passed him in the hall, his jaw was clenched tight. 3 days later, the administrator summoned me. The children had requested a formal meeting. The conference room gleamed. Tall windows, a polished table, leather chairs. One wall held Maple Grove's mission statement, the other a strategy map. Coffee steamed in the corner. It scent heavy in the still air. Daniel arrived first, suit and tie knotted in the same style since his college interviews, placing his briefcase like evidence on the table. Laura followed, blazer over travel clothes, phone in hand until she looked up and saw me. Mark slipped in last, hands in pockets, eyes roaming without focus. The administrator began to outline the new policy, her voice careful, gaze shifting between them. Daniel cut in, calling it an infringement on family rights. Laura followed, voice harder, asking who had the authority to decide when she could visit her mother. Mark stayed silent, his foot tapping beneath the table. I let them speak, then stepped into the room. The air shifted. The administrator moved aside. Daniel froze mid-word. Laura's phone dropped to her lap. Mark's gaze finally locked on me. I walked to the head of the table, set down a folder, and told them I was Maple Grove's chairwoman, and the policy they opposed was mine. Silence stretched. Daniel's brow furrowed, recalculating what he thought he knew. Laura's eyes narrowed, searching for what she'd missed. Mark's shoulders eased just slightly. I explained the rule was meant not to punish, but to guard the time we had left, that this place belonged to me now, and those here deserved more than the occasional holiday visit. Daniel leaned back, jaw working without sound. Laura blinked slowly. Mark pulled his hands from his pockets, resting them on the table. When no one replied, I closed the folder and left. In the hallway, residents stood in small clusters, eyes bright with unspoken meaning. As I passed, a soft ripple of applause began, growing until it filled the corridor. I kept walking, the sound trailing behind me. At first, visits came on schedule because they had to. Daniel appeared every Sunday with a pie, placing it on the table like proof. Laura rearranged her travel to stop in twice a week, sipping coffee by the window, her voice softening over time. Mark came each Tuesday evening, quiet and steady. Weeks turned to months, and duty began to fade into something warmer. Daniel stayed to help serve supper. Laura brought flowers for the lounge, lingering for trivia nights. Mark remained after dark, sometimes walking me to the garden just to listen to the crickets. They stopped watching the clock. Conversations drifted. Laughter settled into corners. One Tuesday, after the others had gone, Mark asked to sit in the lounge by the fish tank. The glow lit his face in gold as he told me he had stayed silent before because his marriage was falling apart, and he feared that fighting for me might cost him the last thing he thought he still had. He couldn't bear losing everything the way he believed I had. His words lay between us like a truth long overdue. I had thought their absence came from neglect. Now I understood how fear could freeze someone as much as apathy. The hurt didn't vanish, but something inside me shifted. Late that summer, we found ourselves together in the garden, the 4 of us. The warm air carried the scent of rosemary. Daniel poured lemonade while Laura set out peach pie. Mark sat beside me, his shoulder touching mine. We laughed over an old story, and the sound felt whole. The setting sun bathed their faces in amber. I thought about how the past stays fixed where it is, but what we choose to do with what's left, that is ours. And I chose love for the time still ahead.